Mal's here to share a few of his tales and his adventures, and he's going to kick off with one of his very early ventures in 1961. Mal had just left school, all of 16 years of age. His brother Mike was already working, been working for about 3 years I think, and he had an old Land Rover that he was running around in and a little bit of cash, so he bought Mal a camera, and their good mate Keith Davey said must be time for a little adventure, so the three of these intrepid guys planned their very first journey. So I'm going to give you to Mal and he'll fill in a few gaps.
Thanks, mate. Yeah, well, what happened was we had this Land Rover, no idea really how to drive it. I didn't even have a licence anyway, and neither did Keith, but Mike did. We had a look at a map of Australia and found this place called Ayres Rock marked on there. We thought we'll go there. And there'd also been a TV series called Walkabout Australia, and that had taken us through the medium of television, a trip right through to Central Australia. So that's what we wanted to do. We made our mind up that was our trip, and ended up, we set off from Newcastle, which was our hometown, and followed the same route that had been taken on this TV series called Walkabout that we'd seen on telly. It was an adventure that you could call a comedy of errors. Would that be the right word?
I think that's probably close. You could fill me in on some of that preparation that did or didn't happen prior to that trip.
We had no idea what we were really doing. We were actually trying to find our way by trial and error. I do not recommend that, by the way. If you're going to be going bush, it's a good idea to do a little bit of it before you do go. And the long and the short of it was that Mike had a movie camera, which he'd managed to win by winning in a trip to the Olympic Games in 1956. And Dad, it was a drawing competition sponsored by Smokey Dawson and Coca-Cola and people like that. And Dad had promised him that if he won the trip, he'd buy them that movie camera that he'd been on about, because he was still at school. And guess what? He won it and Dad had to cough up for the camera. But it was the camera that started off our whole career, plus watching all the early works, as I said, of David Attenborough and so forth. And we got to the rock and climbed up to the top. Now I have to point out that this was in the middle of December and there was nobody else there at any rate. But of course if you go to the rock today, you'll find there's a lot of people there. That of course was something that started our career, but it didn't actually start on television. What it did, it gave Mike the opportunity to use that film that he took to get his first job outside being a signwriter, which was to work for NBN in Newcastle as their first news cameraman. In the meantime, I'd left school and I was looking for a job, so I went into the Newcastle Sun with the still pictures that I'd processed in Mum's bathroom, using the camera that Mike had bought me. And I went in there and asked to see the editor, and eventually I was told he was busy putting the newspaper together, and eventually the secretary, and I thought, right, there's nobody guarding the door now. So I went up and rapped on the door. Big deep voice came from the other side saying, "Come." I walked in and I met Mr. Brock, and he was the editor. He wanted to know who the hell I was. And I told him I'm his new photographer. He said, "I didn't know we're getting one." And anyway, I showed him the pictures that I'd taken, put them all over his desk on top of the work that he was doing, stacked them into a little envelope, put my name on it, shoved it in the drawer and told me to get out of his office. But by the time I'd got home, which took 2 buses and an hour and a half, there was a message to come into the newspaper the next day and meet the senior photographer, the man in charge, and he's the man I really should have seen. His name was Milton Merrilees. I went in there and I got that interview the next day and landed the job and started the day after. And that's how I was working for the newspaper, the Newcastle Sun, the afternoon Daily Sun in Newcastle, at the same time as my brother was working for NBM. So we were rival news services, trying to scoop each other before the evening news or the afternoon paper. Would you like to ask me something?
I will. Right, so that's just a little brief intro to how Mal kicked things off with his brother in the early 60s. They'd been out around the centre, gathering dust in their ears, their eyes and their car, learned a little bit more. In 1963 rolls around and they thought, we might try something a little different. So they got hold of a small tinnie, quite a small tinnie, and they thought, nobody's ever been down the Darling in the entirety. We should have a crack at that. So they bundled up a bit of gear and off they head. So how did that go? No?
Well, we might have been naive when we went out to the rock on our own, but we were even more naive when it came to coming down the Darling River. It is the longest river in Australia, actually. People say the Murray is, but the Darling is a tributary to the Murray, so when you add the two together, well, obviously it's bigger. But actually it's 1,400 miles from Mungandai on the Queensland border to go right down to Mildura, which is what we set out to do in 4 weeks, because we had 4 weeks holiday. Now today you'd have a hard time doing that because the river's dried up badly at the moment in lots of places, but back then it wasn't that bad, but it was completely choked up with fallen trees and snags in the top section. So after we left Mungandai, we found that we were chopping our way with a blunt axe, I might add, through all these fallen things that were laying on over the top, snags, trees had fallen down, and we actually found ourselves in the water, pushing the boat through the water, half the time being eaten alive by these little things in the water which were nibbling away at our skin because we were cutting our legs on all the sharp sticks, and these little gadgets were having a go at us. They were actually kind of a freshwater prawn. They thought we were good tucker, I think. But anyway, we continued our way down the river a bit at a time and filmed the whole thing. If it hadn't have been for the wonderful people of the outback that made us feel so welcome when we dropped into their properties on the banks of the river, I don't think we would ever have made it, because they were so hospitable. In fact, on one occasion, you know, we left this trip, we went down 1,400 miles in a 14-foot tinnie with no oars, because we figured we don't need oars, we had an outboard motor. Of course, the outboard motor didn't last very long. We were hitting snags with it, broke the propellers, shattered them into pieces, and eventually had to pole it along. That didn't work too good. One of the property owners took pity on us and loaned us his oars and said, you can go about 10 mile downriver to the Kalula station, and that's better road on the other side. When you get there, make a phone call through, get some new brass propellers sent back for your motors, and send me back the oars when you're finished with them. This was outback hospitality at its best, and in my opinion, having travelled around the country for 55 years since, I have never seen it get any worse. It's absolutely fabulous. The people that make this country are our country folk, and it's great to be able to say that because they helped us out on more than one occasion. Anyway, the film was very successful. We eventually got to sell it to television in Australia. It went on Channel 9, and then it got sold in 76 countries throughout the world through the BBC. But we didn't make any money. We didn't make a zack. We didn't get it. We got our money back, but we didn't make any money. But it gave us a reputation, so it was time for us to think about doing something else.
Righto, Mal. I just noticed we've got quite a crowd over here listening in as well, so we might sort of look this way so that they can see the better side of your head as well.
Is there a better side?
I think there is, yeah. It's the side that hasn't had all the sun. Okay, so we're moving on now. Enough of the desert, enough of the water. For now anyway. You decide another desert trip's in order. They know a lot about the desert now. You've had a practice runs. So let's tackle something a little more difficult and cross Australia from west coast to east coast, from Steep Point to Cape Byron. And there's got to be more preparation for the vehicle for this little venture, because we all know fuel's a problem today. You can only imagine what it was like back then. So, and tyres have improved too, so yeah. Let's fill the gaps.
Well, we're talking about 1966. Mike and I were inaugural members actually of the Land Rover Owners Club in Newcastle, and we learnt to drive properly by going away with a lot of other people every weekend up and down sand dunes and whatnot, and we learnt all about different vehicles. Eventually, by the time we had organised ourselves and were ready to do our great expedition across Australia, we had 5 members in our group, which was Mike, myself, Keith Davey, who went down the Darling River with me, and Ted Hayes, a mechanic, a very good mechanic, and of course Mike's wife Pat, because he was married by then. So we decided to go from Steep Point, the most westerly point of the Australian mainland, right across to Cape Byron, the most easterly point. The trip itself is the same distance as London to Moscow, but we don't even have to cross a border or carry a passport. Well, we do cross a border, but they're kind of just a line on the sand. Anyhow, getting out to Steep Point on the western coast was really the most difficult part in a way, because there was no road. There was a lighthouse out the end which was not manned, but it was operated with a gas cylinder, and they used to go in there and replace the gas cylinders about every 3 months. And there's a big 60-foot cliff that goes into the ocean, and it's thick, rough travertine limestone, and there's no road. But the thing that was stopping everybody to going out, that had tried to go out, was the fact that there was a huge big sandhill, and that was stopping everyone. Because we had our vehicles set up especially for the desert ahead, because we knew that we would have to cross the Simpson Desert, which previously had not been crossed by vehicle from one side to the other. Over 1,000 sand ridges lay ahead of us, so all of our vehicle preparation had been set up for desert conditions and sand conditions. So we went straight up this dune, and then we went out to the end of the peninsula to Steep Point, which took us 2 days. And then when we got there, we eased the vehicles right up to the back of the cliff and put the tyres just on the edge. There was this big 60-foot drop over the edge. To start the film, we decided to collect a specimen from the Indian Ocean and carry it with us to pour into the Pacific Ocean. Biggest problem with that idea was that we throw a belly can over the end, and the belly can was on the end of a big long rope, and when we pulled it up we had the rope but no belly can. It got ripped off by the rough sea. So we did this again with a second billy can, and then the third, and then the fourth. But now Pat, who was the cook for the whole lot of us, was losing interest in this idea. She says, I've only got one really good one left. We'd actually gone through 4. This was number 5, a very last one. She said, that's my good one. But guess what? The good one was stronger, and it did actually come up with a bit of water in it. We poured that water into a flask and carried it all the way across Australia with us. That was the plan. All we had to do was complete the next 5.5 months that were ahead of us to get to the east coast. Along the way, we went through the Simpson Desert. We arrived at Ayres Rock, or Uluru as we call it today, and it was sunny and late in the afternoon, and we took these pictures of the sunsets on the rock, pitched our camps because it was looking a little bit strange. It had a lot of cloud in the sky. During the night we woke up to a thunderstorm that was absolutely teeming down, and the guy that made these tents deserves a medal because he made a tent that looks like a tent but it acts like a funnel. Put water in it and it turns the floor into a little wading paddle, just the shot for a little baby, but not so red hot to sleep in. So I woke up around about 1 o'clock or so in the morning, a little bit later, and I've been lying in the water. It was about that deep, right? Keith and Ted were so tired they were still sleeping in it. So I gave them a kick to wake them up, and then I dragged myself out there and I looked at the rock, and it was covered in a big cloud at the top, and it had water streaming down it, waterfalls. I set up my camera and took a 5-minute exposure to get that shot. This was just the beginning. I didn't realise it, but in the next 4.5 hours we had 6.5 inches of rain. It broke the drought that had been going for about 8 years, and at the same time I photographed these amazing cascades of rock, and we filmed it all for our film. The thing is that one picture that I took that day became very famous. I sent it overseas to the National Geographic in America, who in turn syndicated it all around the world, and I made more money out of that picture than we later made, a few years later, out of making 3 complete 1-hour television shows. So it was the most successful photograph I've ever taken, but a dead fluke that I happened to be there and the bloody bloke with a camera. It was also the only time it had ever been filmed in such conditions. So this ended up being the famous part of the Wheels Across a Wilderness film that we called the film Wheels Across a Wilderness. But of course we had the big obstacle ahead of us, which was the Simpson Desert. Now the Simpson Desert, as it happened, had 1,105 sand ridges to cross. We didn't know that at the time, but we started counting them as we got away across them. And to work our way across these ridges, we had to winch over 60% of them. We had big long winch cables. We'd get one vehicle up to the top, turn it round, winch up the other one, plus the trailer. We had a big trailer behind us, a 4-wheel trailer, and that trailer was carrying all of our water and all of our fuel, all in jerry cans. I think there was about 80 jerry cans of water and around 100 of fuel, and they were petrol vehicles. But that wasn't the biggest problem. The biggest problem was that the vehicles kept breaking down. Ted Hayes, the mechanic, had his hands pretty full. We actually broke 5 differentials in the desert, about 3 axles, I think it was, in that section of the desert, and we cracked the chassis 3 times. But Ted Hayes managed to weld the chassis up. He didn't have a welder, but he carried the welding rods. He joined 2 batteries together and made a welder out of it and managed to weld back the chassis. And that was how we eventually crossed the desert. It took us a long time, but we got to the other side. After 22 days, we arrived in Birdsville, and Birdsville was civilization. Well, they only had 1 sign on it at the time. It just said birds. The rest of it had been washed down in the storm. And also, we couldn't get out of town because the Diamantina River was in flood. We had to wait 10 days for it to go down sufficiently for us to get out of town and carry on east until we finally made it to the coast, where we poured our, ceremoniously of course, poured our Indian Ocean sample into the Pacific, and that ended the expedition but began the life of the film. We put the film together, called it Wheels Across a Wilderness, and it became the most famous and most successful film we ever made in terms of money. It put a lot of people in the cinemas. We actually made over $1 million out of it, when you could buy a house for about $7,000. 70,000 would buy you a massive mansion. So we were ready for our next big adventure.
That's a fantastic story, that one, and every time Mal tells it, there's another twist that he throws in that you just think, no, can't be true, but it is. Anyway, late in 1968, they decide that enough of the desert. You know, there's got to be something other than just sand and flies and dust. So they figured they'd go back to the ocean this time, because they hadn't had a crack at that. So they looked at the map, and someone threw a pin and it landed on Darwin, and someone thought, well, we've got to come home, so how about we try and get from Darwin to Sydney in yet again another small tinnie. So they put all this gear together, and this was quite an adventure, and again, I'm not sure the preparation was quite up to what was in front of them. No. You can begin with where that started, Mal.
Yeah, well, actually the distance between Darwin and Sydney is huge. And it's the same route that had been taken by Matthew Flinders in 1802 when he was going around Australia, circumnavigating Australia and making charts. And do you know the charts that we got from the Admiralty to guide us through that northern part of Australia were the ones drawn by Matthew Flinders. They're not the originals, of course, but they were copies. And the shallow waters of the Gulf of Carpentaria were the biggest problem from the point of view of a navigation of a big sailing ship, but not so much for a small 18-foot boat. We had other problems that I'll tell you about a bit later, but anyway, we decided we're going to make this film by going from Darwin to Sydney, which would make it the longest open boat voyage in the world at the time. It's been since, by the way, been beaten, but back then it was the longest one in the world. And there was Mike, my brother, of course, Mike, me, and Trevor Tier. Trevor was actually Mike's brother-in-law. It was Pat, his wife's brother. And he was a bit of a mechanic, a bit of a bush mechanic, but a mechanic. And we decided that that'd make up the team, and we all set off from Darwin with high hopes. We'd never been out in the ocean before, didn't know one thing from another, but took the view that navigation shouldn't be too hard. If we kept the land on the right and the sea on the left, we'd eventually get to Sydney. And that sort of technique was what we used. We had all sorts of problems with sharks when we were going ashore. We had a fantastic time in Arnhem Land because we caught up with a lot of Aboriginal folk up there and went out with them, went hunting. We filmed corroborees on Mornington Island, and we had a lot of fun and a lot of really great people that we met who've become lifelong friends as a result of that journey. But it was a hard trip, and it took us 174 days to do it before we got back. In the Gulf of Carpentaria, we went all the way up to Thursday Island to go around the top end, and then from Thursday Island we went further north to an island called Bardu, and that's about halfway to New Guinea, because all the native people there were having a really big corroboree ceremony there. There's a thing called a tombstone opening, in fact, because they were celebrating the life of Eccles Tamhoy. He was one of the great leaders of their tribal group, and it was to commemorate his life. And we were very privileged because we, apart from a priest, one guy, we were the only white blokes invited to go. And we got a really good bit of film out of it. Then it was a matter of coming down the east coast, and in fact that was the biggest hazard of the entire journey. When we got down to Double Island Point, we had a problem with the crankshaft in the motor, on the diesel motor. We went through a bit of rough stuff and it broke the crankshaft, so the engine was out of commission. We tried to anchor in there, and then this guy with a prawning boat came over to us. It was a big 55-footer actually, and Joe Flaherty was his name, and he said, you shouldn't anchor in here tonight because people have done that before and perished, and they had big yachts here and you got this little tinny thing. We said, well, we've got to go to Sydney and that. He said, you're mad. But he says, I'm going to get you out of here. I'm not going to leave you in here. I'm not going to be responsible for leaving you. So he hooked up a big rope. We tied it around the 18-foot boat. This thing was huge. It was 100 metres long. Great big thick thing like that. And it was just on dusk by the time we were ready to get going. Now you see, someone had to stay on the boat to man the pump. Now Mike, he was married to Pat, and there was Trevor, he was married, and I wasn't. So I volunteered to go on it. Now the message here is never volunteer for anything. I ended up in the boat with a little hand pump, 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 pump. The water was coming in, and just get the water down below the floor, but this thing had no flotation in it. Got it just down below the floorboards, and then you'd hit another big wave. You'd feel it coming because the boat would slow right up, because it meant that the trawler was going up a 55 to 60-foot wave, and it'd be pitch black at night, and all of a sudden, bang, he'd take off down the other side. It'd drag the boat through it, and it'd dump all the water into the vessel. So there I was, swamped with all this water. Pump it all down again. Well, this went on for several hours, and by then I'd had blisters on both my hands. The skin had come up into big bubbles. That had burst, and they were now bleeding. And I was absolutely, totally exhausted. And eventually, we got to a stage where we went up a huge big wave, and I got washed clean out the back. But I did have a safety harness tied around my neck, around my chest, and I'm being dragged along. You know, I didn't have any...
Piece of rope.
Yeah.
Safety.
Yeah, well, yes, a piece of rope. I didn't have a life jacket on though. I just got washed out the back. And you know what? All this agony and pain I was feeling actually stopped. I didn't realise I was drowning. I really was drowning. I was on the back there, and it felt like relief. I couldn't believe it. Oh, how good's this? What's happened? Yeah, okay. Okay, right, you didn't like it, okay. So I ended up being dragged along like dead meat on the end, and of course I'm thinking about the fact that this water is full of sharks. But eventually what happened was he hit a really, really big wave. We're probably talking something in the order of 80 foot. It was a monster. But it slowed up the boat sufficiently for me to snap out of my tranced state and realise that I had to do something. So I, hand over hand, pulled myself into the boat, got the radio and said, look, you're going to have to winch me up to the boat, I've had it. So they winched me up to the big prawning boat, turned all the big floodlights on. 1 second I'm looking up at the propellers up there in the middle of nowhere. He had his floodlights on so I could see them. Next thing is, shoom, 50-foot boats down there, and I'm up here looking down on the deck. We're slicing up and down it like it, you know, the two arms of a saw. And eventually Trevor dived overboard, came back and jumped on board, got on the radio and said to Joe, got a new man on the pump now, get going. So he did. Anyway, we kept going. Eventually we ended up at Malulabar, where the whole fishing fleet came down to the river, and there would have all the people that were in Malulabar that were all fishermen all came down on their boats as we came along the river, and they were blowing their horns and carrying on. It had taken us 12 hours to get there, and by then I was completely and utterly exhausted and ready to kill my brother, who was ready to shoot a picture of me getting off the boat. And there's a picture in my biography of me looking at him like I was going to kill him. But at any rate, from there on it was relatively easy. We ended up getting a new engine fitted rather nicely by Perkins. They put a new motor in for us, and told us not to worry about it because Perkins don't break diesel engines. That was their story, because they did it in order for us to have a new engine. Didn't cost us a cent. They fixed it up, and you know what? They did that on Christmas Day. Actually did it on Christmas Day. They brought it up from Sydney and did it. And then we completed our trip, arrived in Sydney, and we ended up with a film which we called Open Boat to Adventure. And that was the film that we spent a huge amount of money on, including a lot of money on the music, having it all written, and it took 20 odd years before we ever recovered the money we'd spent on it. But we enjoyed the expedition. But the film itself wasn't quite as popular as Wheels Across the Wilderness, the one we'd made earlier.
I mean, I'm sure most of these people would have heard about your next ventures. They decided that they'd had a bit of a reputation. 1971. It was time to hit the TV screen and crack into a whole new series. So this was their intro into that. What was that show called, Mal?
Well, we called the 13-part TV series Off the Beaten Track. I'm pretty sure some of you here will remember Off the Beaten Track. We had a little song written for it, and it was all about going to those real wild parts of Australia, but by now we were doing it with a couple of Land Rovers. We had a lot more experience, we knew how to make films better, and of course there was one significant improvement for me, is that after I came back from the boat trip, I met this gorgeous girl who I had now married, and that was Lorraine, my wonderful wife, and I'm sad to report, for those of you that don't know, that I only just lost her. She we managed to get just under 50 years married, but she actually knew my mum through her mum, as it happens, and I was very shy with girls. I'd done a lot of things, but I was very shy with girls, but she was wonderful and ended up being the mother to my wonderful daughter, Carmen. You probably remember Lorraine. She was the one that used to run around in the bikini on all of our shows.
There's a good story about how you met Lorraine, Mal.
Well,
that's probably worth...
Well, yes. Well, how I met her is rather interesting, because Mum was having a hens party. Well, that's what I called it, but it was actually one of these Tupperware party things, but it wasn't for Tupperware, it was for jewellery. It was the jewellery party. And I was sitting there at home with a daggy old pair of jeans on, threadbare jumper. It was winter time in Newcastle, and Mike was coming to bring Pat along to make up the numbers for this show, and I didn't want to stay there. I wanted to get the heck out of the house, but we had a little editing room where we were going to go, and so Mike was going to drop Pat off and we're going to go down and do some editing. So the doorbell rings. So Mum goes to answer the door, and I thought, oh crikey, good, Mike's here at last. You know, he's just brought Mike and Pat. But it wasn't. This gorgeous girl walked through the door, dark hair, blue dress with white spots on it, lovely high heel shoes. This was going to be my future wife, but I didn't know that. She walks in the door, and I sort of went, boo. So I says, can I help you set up your tables or something? You know? So, oh yes, okay. So I helped her set up the tables and all this stuff. And eventually by now Mike had turned up, and all the other women were turning up for this show. And Mike says, come on, it's time to go. So we went out and got in his Land Rover, because mine was broken down. And we were going to drive for 5 or 6 minutes down to our editing rooms when I said to him, did you notice that girl that come in? He says, no. You know, he only had eyes for Pat. Anyway, we got down there, it was freezing cold in the middle of winter, and I couldn't concentrate on anything. All I could concentrate on was this gorgeous girl. So I says, after a couple of hours, I said, why don't we go back? Oh, right, okay, it's getting cold. So we get back, and when I get back, I looked out the front, and there's the Volkswagen Beetle parked out the front. Now, this is the same red Beetle that I'd helped her unload all of her stuff out of. Aha, she's still here. So I dives in real fast, and of course I says, can I help you pack up, you know? And oh yeah, so I helped her pack everything up, and I'm standing there thinking, now here's my chance, boy, what do I say, you know? But being rather inexperienced in this sort of thing, I sat there and kind of didn't know what to say. So she went to start the engine and it wouldn't start. So she hops out of the car, dressed immaculately, lifts the rear boot of the Volksy, takes the distributor cap off the engine, gets a greasy old rag out of the boot, cleans it all up, puts it back in, shuts the lid, hops in and starts the engine. Oh, she can fix cars too! Oh, I've got the jackpot here. So instead of saying something, I sat there and said, good night. And she said, good night, and drove off. Well, about 2 weeks later, she turns up at Mum's place to bring back all the stuff that had been ordered. But you see, I was in the dark room doing some developing. Again, daggy clothes, all covered in chemicals and rubbish. Mum knocks on the door, and I said, she knew not to knock on the door. Why is she knocking on the door? She says, oh, can you open up? Yeah, all right. So I put this stuff in the chemicals, and then I opened the door up, and instead of Mum being there is Lorraine there with Mum behind her. She said, I thought Lorraine might be interested in how you do the pictures. Yes, Mum, thank you. Real matchmaker she was. So I shut the door, and now I had my opportunity, didn't I? She was in there in a tiny little room, so close to me, she was actually touching my body at the back. I could smell her perfume, and I'm trying to concentrate on doing the printing right. So I made a couple of prints and demonstrated how you make a print, only to find I'd gone through all this process, and I thought, oh, obviously this is of limited interest, so I didn't show her anymore. And I just simply took her out to the car and said good night. So she drove again. Missed opportunity. But 3 days later, she phoned up and asked me if I wanted to accompany her to a 21st birthday party that was taking place in a hall. I said yes. And I went. Mind you, I sat around like an idiot chewing on peanuts most of the night, but the thing was, I couldn't dance, and she was a beautiful dancer, but I kind of took her home that night, and when I dropped her off at home, I asked if she wanted to go out the next day, because I was planning to go out to do some bird calls in the bush, and would she like to come along and accompany me? She said yes, and we were married about 3.5 months later. And that was the beginning of the best love affair you could ever ask for. I've written all this in my biography, but unfortunately I haven't got any of my biography books left. I do have another book there though, Gold Fever, which is a story about, well, it's about a gold robbery. It's a whodunit in the Australian outback, of course. Anyhow, that was how Lorraine and I got together.
That's a fantastic story, Mal. A true love story, I think.
Yeah.
And
oh yeah.
Mal still misses her greatly.
I do.
Anyway, moving on just a little bit, something definitely everybody here knows is in 1975 we kicked off with another show called Ask the Leyland Brothers. So this is your chance now, it's the last day of the show. You've got a question for Mal about how he fixed the car, how he planned the trip, how he navigated, anything you like. He'll do his best to give you his version of how they do it. So has anyone got a question? Please put your hand up and ask Mal a question.
Water. How'd you get water, Mal? How'd you carry it?
In what? In the
desert. How'd you carry water?
Oh, right. Well, even if you're going away today with a caravan, I have one really important piece of advice, two pieces of advice about water. In Australia, we have lots of water, but it's not all good water. So make sure you fill your tanks up with the best water you can get, and then don't mix the waters too much after that. If you do have to start mixing up your water with water of questionable quality, that's the reason why the second part of your question is important. That is, don't have one tank, have 2 tanks. If not a tank, at least a jerry can. I always carry at least a jerry can of water, even in the most beautifully built tank. You can still get a rock to come up from underneath and wreck the pipe, lose your water, and suddenly you find yourself without anything. So always have a jerry can as well. I always carry spare water no matter what I'm driving in. And the other thing is, of course, try and source good water in the first place. In most places these days you can still get rainwater occasionally, but you've got to ask people for it, and you've got to make sure. And I've actually been into some towns where they charge you to fill a jerry can from town water, which I think is pretty rude considering that they shouldn't do that, but they do. They do it up in Western Australia. Lorraine and I came across that just last year actually. But the most important thing to remember is make sure you've got enough water to see you through. A jerry can of water for a couple of people is going to last a few days if you have to. There are all sorts of ways to find water as well, but they're far too complicated for me to explain in the time I've got here. Do we have any other questions? Are we all well informed? Oh, yes.
Where's your favourite place to explore?
Oh, I knew someone had asked that. I'm kind of lucky in a way because I really enjoy wherever I am. I enjoy being here. I enjoy being here with you today. But when I go away on trips, I find some places, I mean, there's a couple of places I have to admit that I was pleased to see in the rear vision mirror. But that's only because of people that you meet there that give you a bad time. And you're going to get idiots no matter where you go. The world is made up of mostly nice people with the odd idiot. It's the drongos I'm talking about. So when you go away, you have yourself the opportunity to decide if you don't like the person, but don't judge the town. And there's a lot of outback towns that I've been to by accident. I mean by accident, you know, like I can't resist an interesting track that goes somewhere and I don't know what's at the end of it. There's a couple of times I've done that and ended up in places I wished I hadn't, but most of the time it's the highlight of your trip. So don't let your curiosity at home, do not leave your curiosity at home. Take photographs of the things you like and do, keep people informed, and you'll end up the same as me. If you want to, you'll end up with this insatiable appetite for travel. And we've got the best country in the world to do that in. You know, I mean, where else can you do anything? Look at all this stuff here, look at all this equipment, the whole lifestyle associated with being on the road. I can't think of a better thing to be doing. I have a question here.
What's Mal Leyland's next adventure?
My next adventure starts next week. I'm travelling down to Adelaide. My daughter is flying down to join me, and we're travelling from there to Darwin on a reconnaissance trip to set up a touring self-guided, not so much a self-guided, but we're going to tag along tour, that's what you call it, yeah. And so we're looking for people that want to see Australia, and they'll have two things to contend with. One will be they'll have to put up with me because I'll be the guide telling them what we're going to be seeing. I'll also be taking them into some places that they might not have expected to go. But they've also got my lovely daughter who's a chef, and she's going to be doing all the cooking. So whoever comes with us doesn't have to worry about their food. All they've got to do is come along and have a good time. So any of you want to join a tag-along tour of a bit different, we hope to have it ready by about probably February or March next year. But this is our recon trip that we're doing. Any other questions?
Any other questions there?
No?
Oh, mate. Well, what about, you didn't have a fridge?
No.
We go away and we've got dual batteries, lithium batteries, generators, refrigeration. You had nothing but an esky if you're lucky. Definitely couldn't pick up ice around the corner. So how did you handle that situation?
Well, basically we used to keep, the only water we had that was cool in any way was what was in the water bag, and we used to hang the water bag on the bull bar and the Land Rover at the front. That was one way of keeping the water cooler. Might have tasted like Hessian, it had a horrible taste to it, but you got used to it after a while if you put enough syrup in it and make a cordial out of it. But the thing was that we eventually got to the stage where Lorraine was pregnant and we were doing a trip to Central Australia. And I said, I think we've got to try and look after you, kiddo. We need to get some milk. And we had powdered milk and mixed up stuff like that, but we decided to buy a fridge. We got our very first fridge, which was a gas operated one. And we had the fridge in the back of the Jeep, it was a Jeep we had, and we ran the hose out the window of the canopy up onto the roof rack where we had the gas cylinder sitting up on the roof rack, tied on with a bit of rope and an ocker strap. And that's how we drove all the way through Central Australia and back again. And but we had cool drinks and fresh milk most of the time. I reckon that was a pretty good result. Of course, since then we've got all sorts of fancy gear. I mean, I've got, I think it's what, 3 Engel fridges at home.
Yeah, I think it's all sport rotten.
Yeah, we're all sport rotten today, I guess. But why would you go any other way? I mean, all this stuff has developed so well, isn't it? I mean, why wouldn't you?
Fantastic.
Right, guys, if anyone else has any other question, if not, Mal's got some books here, $15. He'll sign it, he'll even have a chat. And so how about we gather around, give Mal a round of applause for sharing his fantastic life.
Congratulations, mate.
Okay, the one thing I would like to say is all of you folks here are obviously here to see Australia. When you get out there, travel safe, okay? And I hope to see you somewhere on the track. If we bump into each other again, say good day, okay?
Thanks, Mark.